Susan Farley's here today to talk to us about Preserve It Fresh, Preserve It Safe. And I'm glad that we're going to get both ends of the spectrum on that for sure. As a graduate of Kansas State University, Susan Farley provides research-based information and education to people in Douglas County. As a passionate advocate for wellness and health promotion, she provides her expertise in nutrition, fitness, food preparation, healthy meals, food safety, as well as leadership development and volunteer management through her work at the K-State Research and Extension in Lawrence. The majority of her work centers around community issues to improve the health and safety of Douglas County residents by making it easier for people to prepare and eat safe and healthy foods and be physically active. We'll hear from her today on preserving our garden's bounty, knowing exactly what's in our food, and making special gifts for friends. Just some of the reasons that we preserve foods at home. Home food preservation is safe if done correctly. This presentation will provide you the latest, safest methods to can and freeze produce at home, including food preservation methods, essential equipment to use, and research-based resources and recipes. And thank you so much for being here today. And here's Susan.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I want to make sure that you are on the PowerPoint presentations. Is that correct? Can someone say yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, well, let me say that when I'm focusing on this today, I was saying to Chris earlier that you're going to see a lot more in the slides than I'm going to have time to actually read. I don't like to read to you as far as slides go, but I wanted you to, I will provide the slides to Sharon afterwards, so then you can get into the details. And I also have a lot of links that will lead you to other components. So I do have a lot of slides, but I'm not going to overwhelm you with the reading of them. And so when I first think about foods preservation, and this literally, when we do classes for food preservation, we do them actually for full days and do hands-on until COVID happened. And so we early on decided we'd go with the slide presentation, but it still is a lot of information that needs to be shared. And I'm not sure at what point you are in your spectrum of food preservation, so I'm going to hit briefly on a lot of different things. But the very first thing we have to talk about is when we're thinking food preservation, we want to make sure that we recognize the science. It really does matter. That's why it's so critical that we do things safely. And so, of course, what we know is we are actually stopping the growth of microorganisms when we are doing food preservation. And so we have spoilage microorganisms and pathogens. I want to show you here. This is literally salsa that has all this gas that is coming out from it. Can you see it rising once it was open? That is all gas that was actually in that salsa. And so it's very important that we make sure that we do things properly. And we have to inactivate those enzymes, which the enzymes changes the color, it affects the texture, changes the flavor, as well as the nutrition. And so, why do we need to get up to date? Things keep changing, and I have a whole list of reasons why we keep checking all of these. The pH, years ago, We always knew that we could just water bath tomatoes, but now because the pH is different in some tomatoes, now we can recommend doing pressure canning, and we'll talk about this more later, but pressure canning or water bathing, but we have to add an acid to that, which is different than in the past. And so, like I said, here's a good example of, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but at least you'll have this in your repertoire when Sharon sends it to you. Now, the main thing when we talk about actual canning is that we have a very, very difference between, when based on the acidity of foods, whether or not, it always seems dumb when we think about pH, is the lower the pH, the higher the acid in the foods. The higher the pH is the lower acid in foods. And so those list there which of the common foods we have that we can water bath and which ones we have to use a pressure canner for. And as you can see in this diagram, what happens is that for a water bath, the boiling water temperature is just going to get to 212 degrees. Whereas when you put it under pressure, then it actually increases to 240 degrees. And that is what is needed for those low acid vegetables and meats and poultry, that we have to reach that 240 degrees to kill any botulism spores. And so that is the difference there. And so what I want to do first, and I know this, at first you go, well, this is taking up some time, but this is a very good example. This was a great YouTube video that I just saw recently that I hope can describe to you just how important it is to play it safe. So hopefully this will go.
My name is Debbie Miller, and I have a story to tell you. I'm here to educate some of you and to enlighten all of you about what reckless canning looks like. And I vowed while I was in intensive care, paralyzed and on a ventilator, to tell my story as often as I could, in hopes that others would realize the seriousness of proper canning to their safety and the safety of their families. I had prepared jams and water baths, but I had never pressure canned vegetables. My Presto pressure canner was large. I have it here. I had raw packed 6 to 8 1.5 pint glass jars in a pressure canner that I had been given to by a neighbor. It was a well-made Presto pressure canner, but there were no instructions for its use. That was my first mistake. I had no idea how to use this Presto pressure canner. No idea. I did not have the gauge checked out and properly calibrated by the USU Food Extension team. I basically ignored their recommendation. I figured that I could just cook the beans longer and that would destroy any risky bacteria. But finally the day came to can. I bought kosher salt, I washed my beans, I cut my beans and began packing them. I was so excited. And since I was working with my neighbor who had done some canning, I surely wouldn't make any stupid mistakes. Well, just recently, about a year after my near fatal illness, I watched a YouTube video produced by the University of Alaska food safety personnel. The instructor said to fill the pressure canner with 3 to 4 inches of water. As I heard her say this and watched her fill her pressure canner, I was alarmed to realize that out the gate, I had failed to follow appropriate standards. What did I do in September of 2018? I filled my pressure canner to cover the 1.5 pint glass jars of raw packed green beans. I had done that for jams and a water bath, so I guess I would do that for my canned green beans. I knew nothing about the difference between high acid foods like fruits and jams and sugary, bread and butter pickles perhaps, and low acid foods like straight vegetables. I knew nothing about pH levels. All of these things I I learned too late. I put too much water in the pressure canner. I filled it to the top of the 1.5 pint glass jars. By filling my pressure canner with water, it would have never reached the appropriate temperature to kill the botulism. There was no room for the pressure to reach 240 degrees, nor was there room to create the required steam. Also, there was no weight on the vent pipe, which, if it were properly placed, would have allowed the pressure canner to build up the pressure. And we'll get to the vent pipe in a minute. So I locked the pressure canner, and I had no idea what to do next. I didn't consult the dial gauge because, well, it didn't work. It remained at 0. I never got steam out of the vent port, nor did I look for steam to come out of the vent port. I did not even know what that thing was sticking up from the lid of the pressure canner. I just turned off the flame after 5 to 6 hours. I never reached the level of pressure to allow the vent port to release steam for 10 minutes, as would have been industry standard. Like I said, I didn't even know what a vent port was, nor what it was used for. Then there was this metal thing about the size of dice. What was that for? Heck if I knew. It was the dead weight that was to be placed on the vent port after 10 minutes. But I hadn't read the instructions, so I didn't know anything about a vent port or a dead weight. After I turned off the gas burner, I think I did leave the pressure canner cool. I did let the pressure canner cool for a couple of hours, and I believe at about midnight I opened it. I don't remember if I took the green bean jars out of the water then or waited until the next morning to take them out. When I went to the kitchen the next morning, I checked the canned green bean lids after I had taken them out of the pressure canner. Okay, get ready. This is worthy of a shocked hand gesture. As I ran my finger across the top of the lids, some were concave and others were not. So I pressed down on those that weren't and applied pressure. And suddenly they were concave. There was evidence of improper sealing that I ignored. And I even altered and told myself they were properly sealed. The canned green beans stayed on the kitchen counter for a week or so, and I was so proud. Here I was, living the life in Utah, canning just like my grandma, these beautiful jars of green beans adorning my countertop. In about November, I pulled out a jar of my canned green beans and served them for dinner. I don't recall whether I boiled them in water or simply microwaved them, but we enjoyed them with no ill effect. In January, I finished the jar of green beans. I ate them on January 1st and on January 2nd. On January 4th, I woke up with double vision. Something was seriously wrong. I went to the emergency room at Salt Lake City Regional Medical Center as I was in Salt Lake at the time. There was no explaining it. I was rushed in to have a brain MRI to rule out a stroke. The MRI came back clear. I was sent home and told to call in if my condition worsened. The next morning I woke up with a swollen tongue and continued double vision. I could barely hold my head up. The emergency room doctor had actually called me the second morning. I answered and it said, almost inaudibly, "My tongue is swollen. I need to come back." He said, "Come back in." I was again admitted and he asked me, "What have you eaten?" Like a ton of bricks, it hit me. I had eaten canned green beans that I had canned. I had botulism. He immediately got on the phone to the CDC. Blood samples for serum testing were taken. I laid back in that bed in the emergency room and literally watched and listened as the team determined a diagnosis of botulism. Everything was in full swing, and within 10 hours, the antitoxin was flown in from California and administered to me, all coordinated by my emergency room doctor and the CDC. I went from the emergency room to ICU later that morning, I believe, but time was beginning to stand still. I was sedated and I fell asleep. When I woke, it was daytime. Arm restraints were being applied because I had been intubated. I could no longer breathe on my own. I could not move any part of my body aside from my hands, and I had a nasal feeding tube inserted into my nose to my stomach. I would be in the ICU for 9 more days and moved to South Davis Community Hospital for 82 days of recovery, including rehab, included physical, occupational, and speech therapy. I had to be trached. I did not eat or drink for 2 months and had to learn how to drink, eat, and swallow again. Not to mention to be weaned from a ventilator and be able to breathe on my own again. Lessons learned: do a dry run before actually canning low acid vegetables. Find an instruction manual for your pressure canner. They exist online. It would not be that hard to find one. Read your instructions. Watch videos from universities on proper canning techniques. Learn about all of the components of your pressure canner. Assure that each can is properly sealed. No pressing down on those that aren't concave. But the final thing I focused on was telling my story and thinking of venues that I would use to tell it. And when I returned home, I did call Charlie McCollum, the editor of the Herald Journal, and I pitched my story. I said, Charlie, there is a story here. California transplant, comes to Utah, going to live a prairie life, start canning food and living off the land. And I almost killed myself trying to do it. I hope my story enlightens all of you on how at risk us urban dwellers are who come to these wonderful agricultural regions thinking we can just jump into canning. And if I can be a poster child for what not to do in canning, I'm happy to step up and help wherever I can. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that you can tell from that that there really was so many things that happened wrong, and I didn't go ahead and move forward on what was identified, but I think we could easily identify those. And so we do have information. That's what's so wonderful, is that we have the information right at our fingertips through K-State Research and Extension and across the nation to be able to provide healthy, safe choices on how to both water bath, steam can, as well as pressure canning. And we have these available to you. And we have them. We have what is called a Rapid Response Center, and I have that link at the bottom. And again, that's why you're going to get these slides. But it provides all kinds of information related to food preservation. And then in the very right-hand corner, the bottom corner, is you can even check your elevation, because we're in Douglas County. In Lawrence, our elevation is about 877, whereas down in Baldwin, it's over 1,000, and that makes a difference how much time is used and pressure is used when we are canning. And so one of the things to keep in mind is if you are canning or any food preservation, make sure that you have up-to-date current information, because these are our guidelines for when we recommend different particular types of books to use. You can do the complete guide to home canning just online. You can get it. So you can just zoom in on what you're interested in. We sell the So Easy to Preserve book in our office. This particular one here is hot off the press. And then we have all of these bulletins. So there is no reason why you can't get really good information, but do not go to Pinterest or someplace like that to get your information. And don't create your own recipes when it is if it is home preservation. And recipes older than 1994 may be unsafe, so don't use those. And then again, I just purchased this. It just came available. the Ball Complete book on home preserving. And so that we say that and the So Easy to Preserve are food preservation Bibles. This one here, the majority of the information is okay, but what's one of the things that's wrong with it is they recommend that you can use fresh lemon juice. And we know that fresh lemon and lime juice actually change their acidity as they get older, and so they are unpredictable. So you can only use bottled lemon and lime juice, so keep that in mind. And then when we go to the jars are very important to consider because boy, Ball and Kerr are putting out all kinds of decorative jars now just to boost their market, but make sure that they are standard canning jars when you're making purchases. And no, mayonnaise jars do not cut it. Now, when you look at something like this is new, the storage latch jars, but they are not for canning. You see, Ball just put them out, but they are not for canning. They're just for storing foods. But then we have the new nesting jars that nest on top of each other, and they are fine for canning. So you really have to read the labels. And then when it comes to lids, the only lids that we recommend are the 2-piece lids, not the one-piece lids for canning. And so keep that in mind. And we've had a real shortage of lids. We still do actually right now because of the pandemic. And as a result, even Amazon is selling some that when you see in this picture here, see all those dents that are in those are not proper lids. So you really need to go to authorized dealers, and I have that website down at the bottom. And when there are starting to be questions on these reusable lids, and they are safe for home canning, but you must follow the instructions that are with the manufacturers, and you cannot use them more than 10 trips, which means that you can and reuse them 10 times and then you throw them away. And so we have to be really cautious about the popular press because they are very misleading. When you look at Bon Appetit magazine, newspaper syndications, it actually reads in here that I'm just going to read the very bottom of it. Turn off the heat and immediately transfer the hot salsa into warm sterile jars and screw on sterile lids. They will seal as they cool on the counter. There is absolutely no indication that they need to be processed. So beware of anything like this and do not use them. And then, so that's unsafe. So when we go to canning equipment, we have basically the dial pressure gauge, we have the weighted gauge, and then on the right side, you see the actual water bath canners. And so one thing to keep in mind, however, is that some people just have a pressure canner and they only want to use it for water bathing, and they can do that. They just don't put that counterweight on the top. They don't, because that's what starts building the steam up. And so you can use that same vessel as a water canner, water bath canner, but you cannot do it just the opposite. And so we have a pressure canning using a raw pack. And again, one thing about raw packing, and it's perfectly acceptable, but the food, we pack that tightly because it will shrink during the cooking process in the canner. Whereas when you go to hot packing, you don't pack those as tightly because they aren't going to shrink hardly anymore. And so, plus when you use the hot pack, then you aren't going to use as many jars because it's already been shrunk, so you won't have as much product. When you think about the headspace, this is extremely important, and it's important to follow. here what the different amount of headspace, and that is the space between the bottom of the lid and the top of the food. And it is extremely important to use those particular recommendations that are in the instructions. And when you then go to close the jars, you want to make sure you remove any of those air bubbles, readjust the headspace, wipe the jars, rims, and adjust those two-piece lids. And make sure that if the headspace is not adequate or it's too much, then make those changes before you put the lids on. But basically what happens is that at room temperature, before you start processing, this diagram shows that there's air up in the very top of a jar, but then when you start heating it, it actually escapes, the air escapes, which would be in the form of steam, but then it creates that vacuum, and that vacuum is what seals the jars. You want to remove the air, and you want to then seal the jars with the vacuum. And that's why sometimes people say, well, my jar's still sealed. Well, they might temporarily seal if they didn't properly do the recommendations, because they will still have created some vacuum, but not adequate to kill the microorganisms. And so I'm just throwing this out to you, processing time, saying absolutely everything is different in canning as far as the times and the amount of pressure that you put on when doing pressure canning. And so what I always indicate, I still refer to my books. I know those times and temps. I should know them by heart, but I just always want to make sure, because we are playing with someone's safety. And then, unlike what the woman in the video showed, after removing the canner lid, let the jars sit in the canner for a minimum of 5 minutes. And so you want to have them in there for a little bit, but then remove them after those 5 minutes. And so things are going, during the pandemic, we are hearing all kinds of crazy things. And now people are thinking that they can dry can, which means that you're putting raw vegetables in your canner. You don't add any liquid. You're sealing the jars and then pressure canning them for the same amount of time. We must have liquid in those jars in order for them to can properly. So don't ever just pile the raw vegetables in there with no added liquid. You're creating a perfect condition for some really bad things to happen. We've got to kill those microorganisms. And so a lot of people don't know that we do pressure canning gauge testing, and we only do it on the ones that are the dials. The weighted gauges never change, but the dial gauges do. So we recommend that they are checked yearly, and we have that right in our office, and we can check that for you. Now, when it comes to tomatoes, like I said earlier, you can either pressure can or water bath tomatoes, but you do have to use the added acidity for those. We always recommend to add acidity. And so either the lemon juice or the citric acid is what is recommended. Sometimes people might use vinegar. I don't like the use of vinegar in mine, because I don't like that flavor that it provides. But making sure that you add the acids directly to the jar before filling is really the way to go. And if it seems too acidic, then you can add some sugar just to taste, to kind of cut that out. But just remember, and this is so important, salt is only used for flavor in canned tomatoes. In fact, in canning, the only time salt is needed is in pickling. nothing else is needed when it comes to no other salt is needed except for pickling. So keep that in mind, because we don't need to salt your food if you so desire at the end when you're actually ready to eat it. But pickling is the exception to that. Now, when it comes to, well, let's see, lemon juice, can I make a change and use lemon juice or vinegar? If a recipe calls for vinegar, then you can use equal amounts of lemon juice or lime juice. And I do that a lot when I'm making my salsas. I use lime juice because I prefer the flavor. But if a recipe calls for lemon juice or lime juice, you cannot use vinegar because vinegar is not as acidic as bottled lemon or lime juice. And the salsa, that's the one I want to really spend a couple of minutes on, because people still think, oh, I could just make my own salsa. I have this wonderful recipe and I'm just going to use it instead of following any recommended recipes. That is a huge no-no, because the tomatoes, first of all, are high in acid, but all of the other low acid vegetables that you're putting in there, oh, I want some more peppers, so I'm going to put more peppers in there. That all changes the proportions. And so you've got to follow a recipe that is recommended by the universities, or again, USDA, which is what actually what you can find out is the University of Georgia is the national food preservation resource. And so everything comes out of Georgia, and USDA then supports that, as well as when you go to the Blue Book, they support USDA recommendations. So that is really nice to know. But don't just start creating your own salsa and going, I love this better than anything else, I'm going to just use that one. It has to be a recommended recipe. Now, what I do sometimes is I will just freeze my salsa because I think it tastes fresher, and I'll just freeze it instead and then just drain a little bit of the added moisture off. So that's also an option. Now, when it goes to water bathing, again, I've said that tomatoes can be water bathed, or the pressure can, but you really have to follow the recommendations on whichever one you use. But when you're doing when you're canning a lot of your fruits are going to definitely be water bath because of the high acid in them. And so I actually prefer using a fruit fresh or fresh fruit preserver, but honestly, this I use either one of these. Even this is what I use when I'm just cutting up an apple and preventing that from darkening. If I'm going to go to a party somewhere and I just cut up apples with a light dip, I just go ahead and put this. You just put it in a little bit of water, and then I just dip my apples in it, and it provides no added flavor. You know, a lot of times we recommend lemon juice to do that with, or a lot of chefs will use pineapple juice, but I always have this on hand just to use for to prevent darkening of even fruit I'm just going to eat within the hour. And so this actually prevents darkening, and so or heating the fruit prevents darkening. And so these don't work so well in preventing darkening when you are going with the different kinds of fruits for canning. Citric acid, lemon juice, sugar, syrup, salt, vinegar solution. They don't work as well as the other ones I just mentioned. And of course, the liquids that you can in fruit, vary from a sweet syrup to, yes, you can just use water. You don't have to have that added sugar, or a juice, like a lot of pear juices people use in the liquids to can fruit. But just follow the recommendations. Now, here's a new one for you, is that we have just recently found out that white flesh peaches we have absolutely no recommendations on the white flesh peaches for canning in any way because they're higher in pH, which means they're lower in acid. So we cannot, no testing has been done at any university on them. So either freeze or eat those white fleshed ones that way. Do not can them. Now, we also get questions on the steam canners. Are they safe? Well, steam canners are safe only for water bath canning, and they you must limit them to 45 minutes of processing, and that includes any change in altitude. So, and they must maintain a temperature of 212 degrees. So it's just, you know, to me, it's like just another piece of equipment. I personally wouldn't spend my money buying a steam canner. I just would, a water bath canner could be used for so many other things. Now, I'm not going to go into pickles, but we have a whole section on pickles that you can, you know, focus on. And of course, there's 5 different kinds of pickles that you can prepare. And so we have information on every one of these pickles. But food fermentation is becoming very popular. In fact, on November 12th at 9:30, hopefully face-to-face, I'm going to be doing a presentation on taking a new look at fermented foods. And that's going to be November 12th at 9:30 here in the extension office. But fermentation is really starting to take off. You know, we used to think just about sauerkraut, but wow, it's really becoming popular. And of course, I can't think about food preservation without talking about jams and jellies. But jams and jellies, remember, is just another water bath process. And so, but we have to make sure that we have 4 components to make successful jams and jellies, and that includes the fresh fruit, the pectin, acid, and sugar. Now, some fruit has plenty of natural pectin, and so when you see recipes, oh, no pectin is called for, that's because the fruit already has plenty of pectin in it. And then the types of jellies, and I've just talked about without added pectin, but there's lots of jelly recipes out there as well. And so the main thing to remember, and this is an old grandma's adage that we really are trying to make sure people don't do, is use paraffin wax. And in fact, in some stores, I will still see paraffin wax right beside the other types of food preservation equipment. And it's like, no, 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 no. I want to just jerk it all away because that is not recommended. And then one time I've had all kinds of food preservation products brought into my office over the years. And one time, if you can imagine, someone brought these jars in that had paraffin wax on them, but then they also had a canning lid that a 2-piece canning lid that they put on top of that. And my goodness, but there was actually mold growing in between the paraffin wax and the jar or the lid. And they wanted to know, could I just take the lids off and wipe that off on top of the paraffin? And I was going to give it as gifts. And I, of course, I about croaked right then. And no, 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 no. The paraffin wax is not recommended in any way. Then we're also seeing, again, because of the pandemic, we have literally because people have been so in a panic mode about food and not having access to food, that then they're trying to do canning with just putting foods in jars and sealing them up. But we have to remember there's still some moisture in those dried products. And so we never, ever want to put this in a jar, and because there's plenty of moisture in there. So dry canning is not canning. Oven canning is never recommended or approved by any method. And that is just a disaster waiting to happen. Now, when it comes to freezing food, honestly, personally, I have the freezer space for it. So this is honestly the way I preserve a lot of my foods, including all of my tomatoes. I use Roma tomatoes, or I use the little grape tomatoes, and I just wash them, and then I go ahead with my Roma tomatoes, and I go ahead with those and blanch them quickly. Remove the skins, and remove the skins, and then quarter them, and then just bag them and freeze them. But freezing foods is a great process. Now we got to remember though that it's slow, that freezing food slows my microbial growth, but it will not kill or eliminate microorganisms. So if you think that freezing them, oh, I'll just put them in there and it will kill it, that is not the case. But I do really, in fact, this shows freezing blueberries, and whenever you can get blueberries on sale, really cheap, right? You know, at various times, I always buy a bunch of them. At that time, I spread them out on my cookie sheet with either wax paper or parchment paper, spread them out there, freeze them like that. And then once they're frozen, I bag them so they are individually frozen to use for later use. Again, we got to make sure that there are chemical changes. A lot of people say, oh, there's no reason to blanch my vegetables when I'm going to freeze them. I know a lot of people who choose to just put their corn, especially corn on the cob, without blanching them. But actually, we highly recommend to blanch your vegetables, because there's still active enzymes that are going to cause color, flavor, and nutrient changes. And so vegetables should be blanched, not for very long, but it's going to destroy the microorganisms as well as removes the air and shrinks the product. And so make sure that you do blanch your vegetables. And then, of course, there are water, steam, and microwave blanching. And this is my absolute favorite pot. I use this pot for everything, not just blanching, but for cooking pasta or whatever. It's I always laugh and say, boy, whenever I am invited to a wedding, and if I really, really care for the bride and groom, because these are they have a nice price tag to them. I buy this because it's such a multi-purpose pot. I use it probably 3 out of 7 days a week. I love it, love it, love it. Now, of course, there's drying foods as well, and we have a whole section on drying foods. But the thing I really want to make sure that you know is just right downstairs of our extension office, we have a dehydrator that is available for checkout, so you can learn how to use it. Of course, you sign it out, but we have lots of trays on it. So we do not recommend sun drying in Kansas because it's just too humid to sun dry most products. But the optimum temperature for drying is 140 degrees, and you do need air circulation. You can dry in the oven, but you need to open the oven and have a fan blowing in it, so then it circulates the air. Now, a lot of people are getting into drying herbs, and that is super good. And then you can dry herbs in the microwave, or you can also I put mine in a paper bag and hang them downstairs. And then just put holes in the bag, and that works really well. Or again, that food dehydrator works super well to dry dehydrated foods. And I have to bring this up on jerky, because there's, again, a lot of recipes out there to just use a dehydrator to dry your jerky. But there's only two methods for drying jerky, and one is heating the marinade prior to drying, or heating in a 275-degree oven for 10 minutes after drying. And so it must be heated. That doesn't mean that's the drying temperature. You either do a marinate and heat it, or you heat it in a 275-degree oven after drying to kill any of those microorganisms. And again, we have links to that. The strip should not be any thicker than 1/4 inch, thick or less. Now, here we go on flavored oils and vinegars. Flavored vinegars work super well because they're so high in acid, but we are extremely careful, and you cannot can, so to speak, infused oils. You are creating an opportunity for botulism to grow, and so that is not even an option. In fact, I was just telling Marlon this just yesterday, because he says, oh, my sister does all these infused oils. And I said, well, I wonder how she's doing them, because you can only recommend one of these links down at the bottom, which is actually the same link. The University of Idaho did testing to see how we could infuse oils, and came up with a method to do so. But years ago, I had a 4-H'er that did this wonderful gift basket that was full of loaded with all kinds of flavored oils. And I took one gasp and look at that, and it had already been judged. And I took a look at it, and it's like, what is that? And they go, oh, it's flavored oils. And we had to pull it off the shelf, had talked to our food preservation specialist for hours, literally, because the parents could not believe we were doing this, and it is unsafe. And as a result of that, I always say this because that very first food safety recommendations for food preservation exhibits is in existence because of our fear of that oil, the flavored oils that was in that exhibit. And so we added a whole lot more to that besides just the oils, but that actually will tell you that you cannot preserve oils. You can do vinegars, no problem, but and now there are safe ways to you do infused oils. I always have to make sure people are aware of all of these pressure canners or pressure. Let me say this. Well, let's get this pressure canner first. This particular product is not tested by USDA. We don't know if it's safe or not. So I'm hesitant to recommend it, but Presto must stand behind their product. So if we aren't really recommending it, but if the USDA and National Center for Home Preservation provides guidelines for home canning, neither agency certifies or approves home canning equipment. So it is not tested. It has not been currently tested and does not approve this particular canner. These are unsafe processing methods, and we have heard about every one of them. Believe it or not, we've gotten questions. I've gotten questions on every one of these. You can process and sterilize your jars in the dishwasher, but that's it. You cannot do food preservation in the oven or microwave. Open kettle canning is a huge no-no, and in fact, you should never flip over your can jars after you've canned it like this is showing, because that's still bringing in that old concept of open kettle canning. Leave your jars upright. These pressure cookers are not pressure canners, and they should not be, they are not recommended. And the electric pressure cookers are not designed for pressure cooking. for pressure canning, and sun canning is certainly not recommended. And so when this is what we know at this point on the smart cookers or the electric programmable pressure cookers that advise safe low acid pressure canning capability. They advertise that, but as you can read at this point, we find they are not for canning. We will not recommend them for canning. Use them to cook a great meal, but we do not recommend any of these pressure cookers that are so popular now for canning purposes. And so that's a big no-no. As she indicated in the video, here's the signs if you bring out a jar. If it's a bad seal, bulging lids are a no-no, improper color, rising air bubbles, unnatural odors, spurting liquid, moldy growth, slimy. When in doubt, please throw it out. Do not push those down, those jars down to make sure to have them concave. They should just naturally pull that down themselves because of that vacuuming. And what's really cool is now both Oregon State University as well as Colorado have apps that you can put on your phone, your smartphones, so you can go right to your app to find out legitimate USDA recommended guidelines. And of course, you know, there's even online classes now at Michigan State, Penn State, as well as the University of Nebraska. They're very low in price to go on an online course and then be able to just continue to gain information at your own pace at any one of these. But of course, I'd be amiss at not pulling this back up once again, because we have all of the information you will ever need. Karen Blakesley at K-State Research and Extension continues to stay updated on all of the things related to food preservation. Whenever she leaves, we are going to really have a real loss, honestly, because she is just such an expert in it. So at this point, I will take any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And as you mentioned, we do have a number of questions that you were expecting. So here we go on the presentations. First of all, there was a question about checking the pressure for the pressure cookers at Extension. Do you need an appointment? Is there any special procedure for getting that?
What I would prefer if you could just contact me or call Alicia at the office. I'm going to be training Alicia, so then she can actually do the pressure canner testing, which is not hard to do. But if you could just give us a heads up that you're bringing it in, you might need to leave it, and you just need the lid. You don't need the whole canner unless you want us to look at. Some people just bring the dial, which is fine, but sometimes they want to have us look at the lid, look at the gasket, make sure that the gasket doesn't need to be replaced. And so if you would just notify us ahead of time, some people will just drop them off and say, hey, you know, I can come back in a couple of days, then obviously we'll have time to do that.
Great, thank you. And then you mentioned something earlier about recipes before 1994 not being safe. Could you explain why that is?
Yes, the reason for that is because so many of the recommendations, because of testing, are not safe. And so we just basically say, now, if you have a particular one that you really always use, then what I'd recommend is comparing it to one of our up-to-date sources to make sure it is then safe to use, or you could just email me a copy of it. But overall, we say anything under before 1994, because of all of these changes that keep happening, that we keep, you know, this is a science, and that's why I started that way in the presentation. And science continues to change, and so we cannot expect that something before 1994 is still safe.
And then we have a question about removing the air bubbles. So
Yes.
the person says that Andrea feels that every time she tries to remove the air bubble, she feels like she's adding more. But is there a proper technique for?
Yes, what I would recommend is actually, and of course you don't want to use metal, you want to use something plastic that you can go around the outside edge. And I do only the outside edge going all the way around to remove the air bubbles. You don't want to start going in through the product. Go around the outside edge to remove. And so a plastic knife works really well. Now you can buy Ball, you know, they have come up with all kinds of items now, and you can buy these nice little kits that, you know, have this long plastic, it kind of looks like a long knife, and it works really well. And you can get it at Walmart, that packet, but it has the funnel in it. It has that. It has the little magnet that you can lift the jars out, or the lids, excuse me, the flats for the lids out really easily, because we don't boil. You know, you have to use the recommendations on the 2-piece lids now, because we don't boil those to death anymore, because the compound around those lids has changed. So we don't want them to become ineffective. So you just can pull those off. So I actually invested in one of those little kits several years ago, because that is really a nice thing to use.
Well, talking about the lids, that leads us into our next question, which is, what is the latest recommendation for jar preparation?
Oh, okay. I still like to get my jars really clean and hot. And that's why I use the dishwasher, because then I know that they're good, but you do not have to actually have them in a pot sterilizing them. We like to put hot product into hot jars, but we just want to have them nice and clean. And that's why the dishwasher works really nice, but you don't have to boil the jars for a length of time now.
Okay, and now onto a freezing question. So is it okay to dehydrate the cherry tomatoes and then freeze them in freezer bags?
Oh, in fact, we actually recommend, because we live in a county that is high humidity. So yeah, a lot of times people, it seems like it doesn't make sense to go ahead and use the dehydrator and dehydrate foods and then stick them in a freezer. But I honestly recommend it because the moisture is going to slowly start going back into the food, unless you have it in a very airtight container. So that, in fact, you know, when I go out to the fruits and nuts place, I put all of my dried fruits in the freezer right from the start.
Okay, and a couple more freezing questions. Are you supposed to wash your blueberries before freezing?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And pat them dry.
Okay, pat dry. Okay. And another
with just
question.
A paper towel. With just a paper towel.
Someone can no longer find freezer paper in the stores. Is there a good alternative for freezing meats? Freezer paper for freezing meats?
Well, of course, there's several different options you could use, and you're right. Freezer paper is harder to come by anymore. But what you can use is the larger, at least the gallon Ziploc freezer bags. That's always, it depends on how large your meat is, but that's what I use most of the time, and then remove as much air as possible from them. I believe it or not, I am a gadget person, but I do not have one of the sealing bag, one of the sealing to seal your bags to pull all of the air out. I never have invested in one. I might still have to do it, but I honestly think that just by using the Ziploc type of, but they need to be freezing bags, not storage bags. But a lot of times I will use aluminum foil. in freezing my meat, but I will put a piece of parchment paper or wax paper in between each, like if it was hamburgers or if it, anything that I wanted to stack, like even pancakes. When I make a batch of pancakes, I will put wax paper in between each one, and then I will either wrap aluminum foil around it, or I will put them in, I prefer the Ziploc bags so I can take out what I need.
Okay. And how long do frozen veggies or fruit, how long are they good in the freezer?
Typically we say 6 months, but you got to remember that then it becomes a quality issue. It's not a food safety issue. And I know the same question might happen in canned foods, home canned foods, and we recommend that you use them before the next season, before the next canning season. But again, I know people who have had it for more than 2 years, and what I would recommend, or more, we don't recommend 5, but you can in commercial, you could use them, but we always recommend that they stay in a cool, dry place so there's not a fluctuation in temperature, because if they're in the garage or in an attic, there might be a fluctuation of temperature that could affect that.
Okay. And you mentioned the fair coming up, and so there is a question here. Please repeat the fill levels for jars, and is that for product or liquid? And then there's an addendum here. I've been marked down by fair judges for wrong levels.
Okay.
So either too much or too little.
And I'm not pulling that slide because that was general recommendations, but absolutely every recipe will tell you what the headspace should be on there in your publication. So if you, and that is the top of sometimes the product will sneak above the jar, the liquid, which we prefer not, because we want to make sure that the liquid is covering the jar. So otherwise it would get covering the food, because it will get a little bit dark on the top. So we like the liquid to be covering the food, but it is whether it's the food or the liquid, that is from there to the top of the lid is the headspace that we are looking at. Yes, and in fact, in that little gadget thing, that you can buy, it even has one of those measuring things, so so you can measure the liquid, so you're not going to overdo it, or you can measure the headspace. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, that's a sweet little combination of items that they've packaged together for a low cost. But yes, use the recommendation from the recipe.
Okay. And then just a storing question, storing root vegetables. Any tips on storing potatoes, onions, and carrots? Okay,
definitely you want to store them at room temperature, in a room temperature or a cool place. You do not want to store them ever in the refrigerator, because like, for example, potatoes, if you store in the refrigerator, the starch is going to turn more to sugar, so it's going to be sweeter potato, when you don't really want the sweet potato unless you're buying those. But in a dark, cool place is where we prefer storing any of our vegetables. And sometimes people will bag them. If they're going to have them for months, they will actually bag them and store them in a brown paper bag, again, with just a few holes in them, and they will last much longer going that direction as well.
Okay. Well, that is all the questions we have in the chat. We can take a couple questions verbally.
I did see someone say that freezer paper is available on Amazon, and so there you go. That's an option. But I would use aluminum foil or Ziploc, but it's probably reasonable on Amazon. And I would guess that you could probably even go to a butcher shop and just buy some from them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, if does anybody want to ask maybe a couple of quick questions verbally if you weren't able to put it in the chat? I'd like to open it up. Just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question.
I did see here, do you say it's no longer necessary to boil lids? We recommend that you follow the recommendations on the ball or cur lids, and they will not tell you to boil them. And so, but one of the things that Newell, Newell is they have purchased ball and cur. Jarden brands did have it. Now it's Newell, but they are still promoting everything by ball or cur.
Okay. And I think we do have a verbal question from
Sure.
Joan and Thelma there.
Great.
Yeah, this is Joan Grunfeld. I'm at Thelma's house. She's here. Hi, Susan. I don't know if you remember me.
Oh, I remember you. Joan was my internal medicine doctor forever. So yes.
So how long are frozen vegetables and fruits good in the freezer?
Yeah, I say 6 months or less just for quality, but
Right.
it's not a food safety issue. You could have them for 2 years, and
Okay.
it's not going to affect the safety of them. It is just the quality of them that you would maybe notice. To be honest, I always say, and this isn't fruits and vegetables, but people always call me about that with turkeys, and again. Oh, I have a turkey I've had for 2 or 3 years. It's really a quality issue.
Okay.
Totally. It is not. If they've never taken it out of the freezer, if it's always maintained freezer temperatures, it is strictly a quality issue.
Okay, thanks.
And there is a warning in the chat now about purchasing cheap lid flats.
Oh. Well, and that's what I was kind of alluding to, that everyone is selling them now and also on Amazon. And so I can't stress this enough that you must buy the lids that are recommended. And I have that on that list, but it is from the reliable sources. You just do not buy off-brand lids, just do not. And the reason, I say this first of all, you think about the amount of time that you put into food preservation, and then you think about the product, and then you put these lids on that are not recommended, and you have wasted all of that. And it is unsafe, and they literally will buckle up because everybody's getting into this pandemic world right now and lids are hard to come by. So if you find any of the recommended lids, and I'm talking ball or cur, buy them up.
Okay, and don't get them from anywhere else. Great.
And I have to say, when you think about it, think about your discount stores, think about your hardware stores, your small town stores. Oftentimes might have a few available. I know Marlon said just the other day, he goes, I found some just in Eudora the other day. And so keep that in mind.
Okay, well, one little quick question here, and then we're going to have to close up shop here. Can you preserve juices?
Yes, you can preserve juices. Yes, and again, you can certainly follow the recommendations on. I just purchased this brand new book. I just got it from Amazon. And then we also have the So Easy to Preserve that is available for sale in our office. But you can also just go online and find, yes, of course you can preserve juices. One thing that I might say what you cannot preserve is you can't puree foods up and preserve them because it is too dense, and you will never get the center temperature that you need. And a very, very good example is pureed pumpkin. You can get pumpkin and cut it into cubes, and you add moisture to it, but you cannot can and preserve pureed pumpkin like what you would buy in a store.
Great. And then there's a bunch of recommendations for where to find things in the chat. People are putting that in. But someone has a new Presto pressure canner. Should she still have the gauge checked?
Yes, always. Always, please do, because they are not always accurate. You know, actually, what's kind of funny is some of the old canners, you know, that weigh a ton are actually still very good when we go to test them. As far as a lot of times they might need a gasket, the rubber gasket, or the seal, but a lot of times their gauge is in good shape. So yes, we do recommend it.
Okay. And I guess just because these are safety questions coming in, I feel they're important. Can you reuse lids?
Only you can use the actual screw down lids, but you cannot use the flats again, except for that Tadler that is recommending the reusable lids, and then you have to follow the recommendations to a T.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for all this very
and you are right, you know, and there is an induction cook canner now, and that is wonderful. You know, there are so many new products out there, and let me tell you again, Ball or the Newell company continues to attract people to all these new products. I do understand now that some of those they're putting on a halt right now, because they just have to put all of their emphasis onto jars and lids. That's so some of these new products they aren't going to be having as much of, because they've just got to be turning out these jars and lids right now. But don't ever use your flats a second time. And another question a lot of people will ask is, if they did not seal the first time round, can they reuse that product? Only within 24 hours, and then you actually dump it out. You dump the product out, you reprocess it using clean jars, new lids, or new flats, and then your clean lids.
Okay.
And you can also, a lot of times people might have runny jelly, and we also have recommendations on how to perfect your runny jelly. Of course, it also is a great sauce.
Yes, and I put the link in the chat to the main website for food reservation on K-State. It will be available. I will make this presentation available as the PowerPoint and as a recording. We have a YouTube channel now, so the recording of the presentation will be on there. And I will put the slides that Susan will send me on our website, on the Douglas County website, for you to get those links, because there's a lot of valuable information. And I used to think it was a joke when I would make the excuse that I don't can, because I would give somebody botulism. And I guess that wasn't a joke. I was very real. Concern.
Well, I think I also, with showing that, you know, there was a lot of valuable information in that video, and that's exactly why I showed it. But nobody should ever be afraid of using a pressure canner or a water bath canner. No one should ever be afraid of doing that if you're following our recommendations. That's the key. And people have heard of all kinds of things that have happened, but it was for all of these reasons why that happened. And so please do not be afraid. This woman, obviously, and she admitted it, had lots of issues because of the way it was handled.
Great, and that just illustrates what extension is for. We have the information, so please, please, please use extension, ask extension if you have any questions at all.
No Pinterest, no Pinterest.
Yeah, there's a reason we're still here, is because Google isn't all knowing. So thank you all for joining us very much. I'm going to turn this over briefly to Chris Sunstrom, who will again thank our speaker for a wonderful presentation and tell you what's coming up next month.
Hi, I'm Chris, and Susan, thank you. It was wonderful. I really appreciate it. And next month, we're going to have a presentation by Leanne Johnson on preparing flowers and vegetables to exhibit at County Fair. And in July, the Fall Vegetable Garden by Tom Bueller. So, thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the weekend, and we will see you next month. Bye-bye.